Omar, your poem Queanbeyan is included in The Invisible Thread,
Yep.
and you're a Queanbeyan boy, and this poem reveals quite an ambivalent relationship with a place, and you write, it is possible to love and hate a place in equal measure.
Right.
So can you tell us, was there something in particular that sparked this poem?
I'm not sure. I've always been inspired by Queanbeyan. Growing up there, I've always thought, okay, maybe I haven't always thought this, but in the last few years I've thought that Queanbeyan's a bit of a microcosm of Australia, because it's part urban, it's part rural, it's very multicultural, you know, it's got a lot of different aspects to it. So ever since I started rapping and then doing a lot of the slam poetry stuff, I've been trying to get to the bottom of what my hometown's about, and weirdly I usually have to go, you know, somewhere else to write about it. But I think you always have ambivalent feelings towards where you grew up, and then if I am using that as a microcosm of Australia, I've got very ambivalent thoughts about Australia as well. I love it and hate it at the same time. And so I was trying to give a few different aspects in that poem to Queanbeyan, and a different angle on Australia as well, because, you know, often people focus on the red heart or the coast, you know, these different sort of views of Australia, but I know a different one that's a bit more sort of suburban and yeah, very multicultural, a little bit, you know, tinged with a little bit of violence, and I don't think it's written about enough. Like the last few years there have been a few books that deal with it, you know, like The Slap and things like that, but I think there need to be more people coming through and writing about that side of Australia.
We should just say as well that Queanbeyan is just outside of Canberra, so
yeah.
It's not part of Canberra, but it's so
But
close.
it's so influenced by Canberra as well. And I mean, you know, being a Queanbeyan boy, you define yourself as being not quite, not Canberran, but of course, in doing that, you show that there's such a relationship there.
Well, Canberra is the place that Australians love to hate, and Queanbeyan is the place that Canberrans love to hate, even though it's like, you know, it's 20 minutes to Queanbeyan from where I live, so it's right there, you know. And it occurred to me that, you know, you actually defy the image that most people have of this area, in that, you know, most people perceive the ACT and region to be a really boring place, you know, and you're a hip hop artist, a performance poet, you've been involved in the arts. So I'm really interested to know, as somebody who's now living in Melbourne, but, you know, making waves nationally and internationally, what is it like to, or what does it mean to you to come from a place that's considered to be culturally bereft?
Well, I think I hate that attitude, especially of artists who leave Canberra and all of a sudden they say, yeah, I'm from Sydney, or I'm from Melbourne, or I'm based in New York, and then just completely ignore the fact that from Canberra or Queanbeyan. I hate that. It's sort of like, it reflects that cultural cringe a little bit. I'm proud of the fact that I'm from here, and it's just, I think it's a strength because I can talk about an experience that nobody else, people in Melbourne and Sydney don't understand what it's like to be from here. And, you know, so it's an original, it's a unique thing I can talk about. And I think it's good to be proud of where you're from. It's, you know, not necessarily being parochial or anything, but being proud of the local and then having a view to something broader than that. You know, and I think a lot of people have been talking about that. I just read this speech that Irvine Welsh gave about Edinburgh and, you know, Trainspotting was set in Edinburgh. And being unafraid to tackle global issues, but, you know, also not having that cringe of talking about a small place that people consider to be a shithole, you know, because I don't care, I don't have to, I'm not sure why you would have to pretend you're from Sydney or Melbourne to be proud of where you're from. There's fascinating stories from Canberra and the history of Canberra, and it's stuff that's not written about, and I'm attracted to that more than, you know, the coast or the dead heart or these fashionable sort of cities.
And you grew up around the Canberra art scene, so you had a very rich experience in Canberra.
That's the other thing, is that people always bash Canberra, and I mean, I can understand to a certain extent if someone just came here and had no idea what was going on, they might just stand in Garema Place and go, well, what the hell do I do? But I've been lucky enough to grow up around the art scene and know that there's so much happening in the theatre and with music and dance or whatever, and the visual arts as well, that there's so much going on in Canberra, and it's really a rich place to grow up. And so I've always been proud of that. You know, I mean, in the 90s, even here in Gorman House, this is where I grew up around all this when my mum was editing Muse magazine. And I saw, you know, Splinters and all these things that were happening. And so I've always thought it had a rich cultural experience. But then again, with that love-hate thing, you get to a certain point because it is a bit smaller and the audiences are a bit smaller and you can't do gigs every night or every few nights where, that's why I had to move to Melbourne, was just to make a living. You know, it was impossible. I stuck it out in Canberra for years and years and I just wasn't able to make ends meet. And so that's something that I'm not sure, a lot of people are talking about working on that and trying to develop it to a point where professionally you can make a living here. But as a poet and a hip-hop artist, it was just impossible,
So let's talk a bit about poetry, because you've talked recently at a children's group forum about how poetry is mostly seen to be irrelevant and boring.
Right.
And that it's mostly, middle-class, middle-aged white people who are writing poetry.
Yeah.
And that this is something that you really want to change, and you want to make poetry more accessible to young people.
Yeah. Oh yeah, definitely. And last night I was actually hosting the very first, or maybe it was the second, ACT Youth Poetry Slam that was open to students in high school and college all around the ACT. And it was really exciting to see how many young people of all different backgrounds are starting to get involved in poetry. So, but I still think there is that stigma attached to it. And I'm not sure why it developed that way or what the reason is. Maybe sometimes it's taught badly. It's taught by really snivelling, uptight people who, think that modern poetry is really crass or vulgar, but then they're willing to teach, John Donne or whatever it is. But for some reason, it just got to a point in Australia where people thought it was really boring. On the other hand, I don't think you can really lose your love for poetry because it's an instinctive thing in humans. I think they deep down love poetry, and a lot of people, write poetry just for themselves, and people still always love song lyrics. But it's more just the label of poetry that has become seen as something really pretentious. And I think that it's undergoing a revival at the moment, for sure. In the last 5 years, I've already seen how many more people are getting involved in it. But I still think there's a way to go. I saw the New South Wales Premier's Literary Awards. I think there was, out of 50 books that were judged, 2 were from people of non-Anglo Celtic backgrounds. So I don't know if that means that people of African or Middle Eastern backgrounds or Islander backgrounds are doing more spoken word poetry and not writing it down, but I still think that.
So you're noticing a difference between the people who are performing the spoken word poetry and the number of people who are getting published?
There is a disparity, and I'm not sure whether that even matters, because if people are performing it and living it, then maybe they don't need to be.
Tell us about slams, and if you can explain a little bit about what a slam is for people who don't know, because you won the Australian Poetry Slam in 2008, and you've talked about that being a really good way of getting young people involved in poetry and loving poetry.
Yeah, well, it's because it's really accessible, and I don't think it's the be-all and end-all of poetry. People often get me wrong, even after that Childers forum, that someone, even though I made a point of saying that it's not the only form of poetry, people were saying, oh, Omar Musa, he hates older poets and he's disrespectful and all this sort of stuff. And if they want to think that, then, fuck them. But poetry slams are a competitive form of poetry. It started in the 80s in Chicago. And it was basically, the idea was to bring it back to the people. So, they'd throw out condoms or toilet rolls or whatever and get 5 random judges from the audience, so that they weren't academics or poetry experts, to judge, and then people would get on stage and have 2 minutes without musical accompaniment or props, and just impress the audience with their poetry. And then the judges would, say who was the best, and they would win. Well, sometimes you can win large amounts of money, sometimes you can win just the respect of your peers, sometimes it's half a bottle of bourbon, whatever it is. But it makes it more interactive, and it's about the audience, and it's also about making it short and snappy so that someone can't ramble on for 20 minutes and not get booted off stage, even though they're really boring. And so it's just a really good way of getting young people involved, and people love it. The audience loves it. But as I said, it's not the be-all and end-all. I don't do slams anymore. I found it a bit stressful, and after a while, you sort of start to think, you start to see certain things that could win a slam, and you think, oh no, I'm going to compromise myself here because if I start just writing to win, it sort of loses the whole point of it. You know, so I don't do slams anymore, even though I'm a huge advocate of the form. And I've just seen with young people how they can just get into it straight away, because you can be a rapper or a comedian, or I've seen old swaggies with corks hanging off their hats and long beards doing it alongside grimy graph artists who are rapping about the streets or whatever. And so that's the good thing about it. You don't have to be a certain type of poet, but it's just about, you know, how you use your voice and how you tell your story.
So tell us who the poets are that you love.
Oh man, there's so many. I mean, if I'm talking about rappers, then there's Nas and Andre 3000 and Common. And then when it's the page poets, oh wow. I love, I think Bertolt Brecht is one of the, as well as a playwright, he's one of the best poets that ever wrote. Anne Sexton, American poet from the 60s, is probably my favourite, because her stuff is really crafted and original, but it speaks to really deep human emotions and fears, and I like that. Who else? I like storytelling poets as well, like Robert Browning. I always really liked him when I was growing up, because he would inhabit characters, and I really liked that. And it was deceptively simple writing. Who else? God, there's so many. Faiz Ahmed Faiz, he's a poet who wrote in Urdu, who was really amazing, wrote a lot about the sort of loss of the beloved, whether that be a lover or a homeland, and revolution. I don't know, I just sort of trawl for new stuff all the time, and it's probably, whenever someone asks me a question like that, I usually just think about the last person I read. I can never really answer that question too properly, but I don't discriminate, you know, like I could be as influenced by a playwright or a poet or a rapper, you know, as a novelist. And I take a lot of my poetry is storytelling, you know, it's sort of half prose, half poetry, so I take a lot from novelists as well. I mean, you know, Cormac McCarthy is a big influence on me, and Roberto Bolaño as well. I like stuff that's a little bit boiled down, although Cormac McCarthy can be a bit of a ham, but I like stuff that's a bit sort of simpler and boiled down, and just, you can punch people with it. And a little bit more brawny stuff, yeah.
So what do you love about writing poetry for you?
Well, I think I'd just go mad if I didn't do it. It's just a form of creatively expressing myself, and it's a form of therapy. I just don't think I'd be able to live if I didn't write poetry. And I think I was lucky because my parents encouraged me to do it at a young age. I didn't grow up in a household that said, oh, that's, you know, oh, that's pretentious or that's puffy or whatever. You know, my parents they didn't give me Game Boys and Nintendos or whatever. They just said, oh yeah, you know, if you're bored, here's a piece of paper and a pen, and you could draw something or write a poem. And my dad was a poet in Malaysia, so when they found out that I liked doing it, they always encouraged me, and I'll do it of my own accord. You know, no one had to force me. I remember when we were talking about my year 5 English teacher, Ms. Patterson at Forest Primary. I remember she set us this task, and it was to write a poem about maybe Egyptian mythology or something, and I just went and wrote like 7 of them, because, you know, everyone else was going, oh no, we have to do, you know, to write this poem, and I loved it, and even further back, I think this is drawing a long bow, but my mum reckons when I was a kid, I used to arrange the letter blocks, you know, in patterns, so maybe that was like poetry, you know, I'm not sure. Yeah.
So which do you prefer, performing poetry or writing poetry? And I'm not necessarily talking about performing at slams, just in general, because you're a brilliant performer of poetry. Which do you prefer, or are they two totally different things for you?
It depends. The two wouldn't exist without each other. I love performing, but, you know, I've just taken 2 months off performing, and I've just been writing and sort of locked away like a bit of a hermit, and I've enjoyed that, you know, because you don't want to be out there all the time under the audience's eye being examined. But then there is a joy to performing the poetry. But, you know, my book, The Clocks, none of that stuff is really meant to be performed, only a few of them. So it just depends what mood I'm in. And with this novel, you know, I'm writing this novel at the moment that should be out, well, I don't know when, but hopefully next year. And I thought I would just be able to focus on writing that and that I would enjoy that process. But I found that, you know, when I get a bit over that, I have to go and write some raps or write something that I know people are going to hear or that I could perform. So it just depends what mood I'm in.
Sometimes it works really well having a few forms, doesn't it? Because when one thing's not working, you can go and do something else and get a break and then come back to it later.
It's a good way of dealing with writer's block as well, because, you know, sometimes, yeah, you're looking at the page and you're just thinking, fuck, I've no idea what I'm going to write about or how to get at this at that particular point in time. And then, you know, you just go and listen to some music and I write a rap or a chorus or whatever, and then I come back refreshed to the other thing. So it's a good way. I never find that I have too much writer's block because, you know, if I'm bored of writing the novel, I'll go and work on the play, and if I'm bored of writing that, I'll go and write a rap, and then if I can't write at all, I'll go and listen to some music or read a book. And I think reading a book is the best way of dealing with writer's block, because you'll just find an image or a story or a character or just a perspective and way of looking at things that'll unlock something else that you can then use.
So tell us about the novel, because it's been accepted by Penguin, which is amazing for a debut novelist.
Yeah.
Tell us a bit about the book.
It was weird how it came about. I've always wanted to write a book, and I always thought writing about Queanbeyan, even though I haven't really mentioned that it's Queanbeyan, so I shouldn't say that on camera, but it's about a small town in semi-rural Australia where a lot of grimy things occur, and it's about a man who starts a bushfire on purpose. And I always thought, I've never read a really good bushfire novel. I mean, people have written about them well, like Patrick White in Tree of Man has a really good bushfire scene, but I've never read a really good bushfire novel. And I thought, having grown up in Canberra and seen all the bushfires in, when was it, 2002, it's the perfect backdrop for a novel. And so I'd written a few things down, maybe like 2 or 3 pages, and I was on radio in Melbourne, and Sophie Cunningham was saying, "Oh, so what are you working on?" And besides my hip hop album, and I was like, "Oh, I'm sort of writing this, you know, Dorothy Porter-esque verse novel, totally just talking shit." You know, I'd written 3 pages, and she goes, "Oh, wow, really? Oh, that's fascinating. I'd love to, you know, show that to some people or have a look over it." And I was just like, "Oh God, all right." And so I kind of talked myself into a corner, and she asked me after we got off air, like, "Oh yeah, you know, when can I see something?" I go, "Oh, just give me a little bit of time to think about it." And so I went off and just wrote for about 3 weeks, and I wrote a chapter, the first chapter, which starts off at the greyhound races with 4 mates doing cocaine at the greyhound races, based on a true story. And and I thought that was quite a good way to open a book. Anyway, so I sent it off to Sophie, and then she was very encouraging, and I sent it off to a few other people who I was lucky enough to know from writers' festivals and whatnot, and they seemed to really love it. And so I just thought, okay, well, I knew 2 people at publishers, and I just sent them off, and they asked for a little bit more. I wrote 3 extra draft chapters, and yeah, I got the deal with Penguin, which is just the completely the wrong way to go about things, you know, from what I've heard. I don't have an agent or anything, but now I've actually got to finish the thing. And
so I'd like to know how you would ideally see poetry being regarded in Australia in the future.
It's a hard one to say. I would just like it to be really popular, and for kids see, it's bigger than poetry. It's more, I'd like a culture in Australia where intelligence and creative pursuits are valued, as opposed to seen as something lame or stupid or overly academic or dusty. You know, being a good footy player, a good swimmer shouldn't be the one defining thing amongst young Australian people, because I feel oftentimes Australian kids are afraid to express themselves creatively, and I just think we should be helping foster a culture where that's celebrated and where intelligence is celebrated, as opposed to just kicking a fucking pigskin around a paddock, you know? I mean, that's cool as well, because like I grew up playing footy, I love footy and everything, being a Queanbeyan boy, but I just think it's really sad when there's all these kids who are afraid to express themselves, especially kids who can often feel dislocated, you know, of all these different backgrounds, people who are new arrivals in Australia, or kids struggling with their sexuality or whatever. Poetry, as I said, is a just amazing way of expressing yourself, and it's therapy. and it can help you cope with just day-to-day life. And that's the other problem, is it's seen as something, it's off in this ivory tower, whereas I would like to see it enmeshed and woven into the cultural fabric of Australia. Because there are a lot of countries where that happens, you know, like my mum was saying she went to Iran, and they just, you know, they were just sitting around for a meal, and everyone said, oh, well, why don't we just recite some poems? And that wasn't seen as, and she was a bit embarrassed, because, you know, here you don't memorize poems, you don't know them. But over there, it's really something that's part of daily life. And, you know, my dad growing up in Malaysia, they have this thing called the pantun. It's basically like Malaysian old school freestyling kind of, you know, you just make up poems on the spot spontaneously with your friends for fun. And I'm not sure we'll ever get to that point in Australia, but I'd like to see it just fostered and encouraged more. And maybe with poetry slams, get it to a point where they do this in the States and in Europe, you know, they fill a basketball court full of high school kids supporting their favourite young poets. And I would love to see that, because it would just be, it would be liberating for young people, for a lot of young people, and just give them another way of expressing themselves. So, you know, that's my meagre hope for poetry in Australia. I slap my eyes closed, black, and hear nothing besides the occasional gruff tabby or tortoise shell, arching and scrapping beneath street signs. Yet the town vibrates softly with the echoes of many things, of alcoves clustering in the park, fighting and speaking through their noses, crumpling casks of Coolabah, of lone widowers tossing bread crust to ducks, using the rest for jam sandwiches, of high schoolers who punch cones behind sheds in free periods, then come home and bully over Facebook or hunch over with gritted teeth, masturbating at broadband speed, of the Leagues Club where whores hang after shift work, playing the pokies, fingers smelling of rollies, the carpet rich with Jim Beam and cola, of paddocks where we played armies, plucked blackberries, found used syringes and hunted for trilobites in shale, now levelled for yuppie flats in stucco and terracotta, of ovals, the cold topsoil patterned by a season's worth of stud marks and quartered orange peels and orange mouth guards. If you listen, further beneath, you hear the tinkle of 35 types of chili seeds found nowhere else in Australia, carried here in corduroy pants and between teeth. Somewhere, further down, you hear the muttered dreams of tribes who once gathered to feast on bogong moths where the two rivers meet. It is a place that breeds disobedience. It is a place where you can still see the stars. It is possible to love and hate a place in equal measure.